Their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Do we have any English teachers or grammar stands with us today? Their eyes were kept from recognizing him. This is a sentence no English teacher can abide. Why? The dreaded passive voice. Their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Why couldn't they recognize him? Well, we don't know, because the passive voice obscures the reason for their inability to see Jesus, their friend, right in front of them. These two disciples had walked with Jesus before, learned from Jesus before, spent the day with Jesus before, and yet their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Why? Luke does not tell us, and his grammar is no help here. But maybe we can speculate a little bit. Maybe Jesus looks a little bit different after the resurrection. Maybe the experience of the terrorism of the cross and the glorious resurrection of his body meant that he wasn't immediately recognizable. Maybe they just weren't ready to see Jesus again. Despite his promises to return, did the cross seem to them so definitive, so conclusive, so irretrievably deadly that they couldn't imagine that the executed Jesus would be standing before them? Maybe he looked like he always did, but they simply were not expecting at all to see him. Were they so deep in grief and loss that they missed Jesus standing right in front of them? Or maybe, just maybe, Jesus was wearing a Zorro mask. Maybe he comically changed his accent to something ridiculous. We just don't know, because of this frustrating sentence cannot give us an answer. Their eyes were kept from recognizing him. I read this and wonder where my red pen is so I can fix Luke's broken grammar. But Luke's mysterious sentence is the beginning of a powerful story, a story that can change us, that can teach us the shape of God's grace anew today. But first, we have to remember that Jesus loved to eat. At the beginning of Luke, we learn that some call Jesus a glutton and a drunkard. Apparently, for some people, these are insults. It makes me want to hang out with Jesus that much more. Jesus is always eating, but never eating by himself. He eats with those filthy, treacherous tax collectors, those dirty, undesirable sinners, but he also eats with the powerful. A Pharisee named Simon invites Jesus only to have a sinner woman crash the party. And at that meal, Jesus lets that woman touch him. Jesus feeds 5,000 men plus an untold number of women and children in the middle of nowhere. Jesus invites himself to eat at Zacchaeus' house, forever changing how his neighbors see this misunderstood tax collector. Jesus eats all the time in the Gospel of Luke. But why? You see, meals in antiquity were not just interruptions in one's days to fuel your body. Meals were social moments, political moments. Meals were moments when you learned where you belonged and where you don't. Meals were about relationship and community, and too often about exclusion. Meals were powerful symbols, that is. And isn't this still true for us today still? I want you to take a moment and think about the greatest meal you have ever had. I want you to ponder it, to picture it. Bring it to mind, imagine it right now. What came to mind as you pondered this fabulous meal? In my experience, we are far more likely to think about people and places than the things we ate. That is, I should have asked you, who do you think about? And where were you, more than I should ask, what did you eat? I imagine some of you remembered family meals at the holidays, surrounded by the people you love and the traditions that shaped you. Some of you remembered a special trip to a new place, You remember who was at these meals, especially when these folks are no longer with us. Maybe you remember a hard-won meal after a marathon. Maybe you remember a meal that changed your life. Behind all these powerful meals are powerful stories. Because meals are places of belonging for us and for Luke alike. Food feeds the soul in our relationships as much as it feeds our stomachs. Meals matter, and thus it is no accident that Luke's Jesus spends so much time eating with all the right kinds of people and all the wrong kinds of people alike. And so we join the disciples again on the road to Emmaus. These two disciples are distraught. They enunciate what I count as the saddest, perhaps most tragic bit of Scripture. Luke records that when Jesus asks them about their conversation, they stand still, looking sad. And they respond, "We had hoped." We had hoped. We once hoped, but no longer do so. We had hoped, but our hopes were dashed. We had hope, but those hopes were crushed on a Roman cross. We had hoped, but now we sit in despair. Perhaps you know this feeling all too well. It feels fresh in my mind. Sometimes it feels like hope is a fool's errand, when our prayers float away like wisps of smoke in the air. Hope sometimes feels naive, when the world keeps disappointing us day after day. Hope sometimes feels like a ready path to despair, when it feels like every step we take is accompanied by two massive big steps back. The disciples stand there in their despair, in their hopelessness, in their grief. And I wonder if you can feel yourself on that road of despair with them today. If you do, notice what these forlorn disciples nonetheless do. Though they had lost all hope when they saw their friend die on a vicious cross, they nonetheless try to offer hospitality to this stranger who warms their hearts in the way only one other person had before. They say to this new friend, "Come and stay with us." They offer to host him for the night. But then Jesus, their old friend, flips the script as he so often does. He becomes the host. He takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, he shares it with his friends. And then, only then, were their eyes opened. They didn't recognize Jesus when he was teaching them or walking next to them, stride by stride in the middle of the day. They didn't recognize his face, his voice, his body. They didn't recognize Jesus until Jesus does the most Jesus thing that Jesus does in the Gospel of Luke. He took bread and shared it with his friends. I've become convinced that if Luke had chosen a picture of the gospel, instead of 24 chapters of writing, he would have placed before us not a cross, or Jesus preaching from a mountain, or Jesus ascending into the heavens. Instead, Luke would have drawn for us a big table, wooden and worn and homey. And around that table would have been all kinds of different chairs, spaces for all kinds of people. And piled on that table would be mounds of delicious food, food that we ate at our grandmother's tables, that food you imagined just moments ago. But there would also be some strange food, food you don't recognize, food with smells that you can't account for, foods that you can't even begin to imagine how you would begin to eat. But at this table, such strange food is a delightful curiosity. A dish that makes you wonder who else is sitting at this table. For who is that food the story of their lives? And when you look to your left and to your right, you see people you've loved and lost, people you've never seen before but love at first sight, people you wouldn't have thought would make it through the pearly gates. And at that table rings with delight, with laughter, and with joy. And one more thing, my friends, that table has no end. There's always one more chair to pull up. The invitation list is open. This table is for all of us. No exclusion, no reservation needed. Payment is not accepted because the table is open and free and bountiful. As I once read online, when you have more than you need, don't build a higher fence. Build a bigger table. As I wrote this sermon, I thought about our house, our home, the one my wife, my 2 children, and I have co-created. I thought about all the meals that we've eaten together. And I understood something finally that my body and my heart already knew. My spouse, Holly, is an extraordinary cook and baker. And my family of origin introduced her to the joys of Puerto Rican food and cooking. And if you know Puerto Rican food, you're going to stop listening to me for a second because you're going to think about all these foods, right? Plátanos, mofongo, arroz con gandules, pan sobao. And she, being the extraordinary cook that she is, learned how to make these dishes because, yes, the food is awesome, but also because she loves me and the land that made me, the food that nourished me as a child. When she cooks in this way, she is a guest in someone else's story. Why? Because she loves me along with our half-white, half-Puerto Rican children and the land that helped to make us a family. And the love goes both ways. Holly's family includes a strong Italian heritage with the best of its traditions, including the tradition of Sunday gravy, or as it was known in Holly's family, sauce. Just sauce. It's not just sauce, but that's just the word they use. One word carrying so much meaning. And I love that sauce. I love gravy. When I eat at that table, I am a loving guest in someone else's story. And all of a sudden, the world gets just a little bit bigger. There's a certain kind of warped theological imagination out there that has fed us a lie. That we own the table to which we invite others, that we are perpetual hosts, others are perpetual guests, that hospitality is something we give, rarely something that we receive. We imagine ourselves as those who might house someone fleeing danger, but rarely do we imagine ourselves as the refugee or the migrant. Simply put, that kind of imagination forgets how to love. But Jesus, my friends, Jesus wants to free us from this colonial imagination, liberate us from its narrow constraints, its binding chains. Jesus wants to set a new table before us, a table where the food never runs out, a table where there's always one more chair, a table where I'm ever a guest to others and ever a host to the same. My friend, that table is set before us. Jesus begs you to sit, to eat, to delight, to live. The meal has only just been set. The ink on the invitation is not yet dry. Your chair is waiting. The chair next to you is open. And our call to love our neighbor, to be in community with the stranger, to taste anew God's transformative power, it has just begun.